The Australian Financial Review.
If you'd made a fortune from a startup that turned into a multinational company, how would you spend your days? Playing golf? Sailing the Whitsundays? Relaxing on your own private island? It's now 6 years since Andrea Cecchini cashed out of the software company he helped create. But he's not exactly taking it easy.
I had frostbite nearly every day on my fingers, toes, face. It was so painful. We came home, my face was blue, black. My toes, I lost sensitivity for a few weeks. I thought at some point I was going to die.
For the past 2 northern winters, Andrea has ventured towards the Arctic Circle to fight climate change on the front line. Global warming is melting the crucial polar ice shelves that help regulate most of our planet's natural systems. But Andrea and his team, they've got a rearguard action underway. They're literally pumping water up there to thicken the ice.
Nobody was really doing anything, but it is so important. This is critical.
In a world full of big green ideas, this might be the most ambitious yet. So rug up, because today on Tech Zero, we're refreezing the Arctic. Promising action on climate change is the easy part. Delivery is so much harder, and right now, the world is finding it hard to live up to its promises to tackle emissions. But not everyone's given up. I'm Peter Kerr, and welcome to the Tech Zero podcast, where we bring you the big green ideas that could get us to net zero and the people risking everything to make them work. I'm not going to turn this into a lecture about how important the polar regions are in the fight against climate change, because I reckon you're smart enough to know that already. But for the record, let's spend 60 seconds explaining why just about nowhere on Earth matters more than the ice at the North and South Poles. It's not just because the melting of all that ice would trigger big sea level rises. The frozen white caps of the Arctic and the Antarctic reflect huge amounts of solar radiation back into space.
If we lose the sea ice, the Arctic becomes a heat absorber instead of a heat reflector.
And where the ice consistently covers land, like in northern Canada or Greenland, it freezes soils into what we call permafrost. Some scientists reckon the uncovering and thawing of the permafrost could release huge amounts of naturally occurring greenhouse gas into the atmosphere. And that would be like pressing the fast-forward button on climate change.
By sort of melting permafrost, we risk a massive escalation of climate change. So that's a big risk.
There's countless other reasons to want to preserve the Arctic. But my 60 seconds is up, and I haven't even given you the bad news yet. So here it comes. According to US government statistics, the amount of sea ice in the Arctic in September 2023 was 42% less than it was 27 years earlier.
We risk seeing what they call the first blue ocean event already in the next decade, in the 2030s. A blue ocean event would be a moment at the end of the summer where we virtually have no sea ice left in the Arctic. So we would see the North Pole for the first time in over 1 million years with no sea ice coverage. That would be pretty dramatic as an event.
But here's some good news. Someone's actually trying to do something about it.
Hi, my name is Andrea Cecchini. I work for Realize. I'm the co-CEO, and I'm here today to talk about how to preserve and restore the Arctic sea ice through a method that we call ice thickening.
Andrea was a founder and chief technology officer at Ion Group. They're a financial software company with offices in more than 40 countries these days, including one on George Street in Sydney. When Andrea cashed out of Ion Group in 2018, he didn't really need to work again. Is it fair to say that when you exited that very successful startup, you were financially secure? It left you with the ability to go and look around and pursue a passion project?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yes. So I had the luxury to look around and think again about my passion, which at that time was, science, environment, and climate change was something very, very close to my heart. And eventually the Real Ice opportunity came.
Real Ice was the brainchild of some students and volunteers at Bangor University in Wales. Led by a guy called Cian Sherwin, they started designing machines that might one day be capable of thickening the ice in the Arctic. By January 2022, Real Ice had been registered as a company in the UK. And shortly after that, they asked Andrea to come on board to share his experience in running technology startups.
I said yes in about a millisecond. So it's a UK-based startup. Our mission is to demonstrate that ice thickening as a method is an effective way to preserve and restore Arctic sea ice.
In January and February 2023, Andrea and the team got their boots on ice for the first time when they ventured to the remote Alaskan town of Nome. You know that bit on the map where Russia and Alaska almost touch each other in the North Pacific Ocean? Well, that's pretty much where Nome is.
So we chose a spot where we could operate, and our operation is relatively simple. We go out at sea on top of existing sea ice. We make a hole in the ice using a machine which is called an ice auger. And then we put a water pump into the water. We made a hole about 20 centimeters wide in diameter, 80 centimeters thick until we reach the water. We operate the pump and we start to pump water. What happens? The water comes on top of the existing ice and it freezes fairly quickly because it's cold, obviously, in the middle of winter.
Have you got a mental picture of that? There's a hole in the ice about the size of a family-sized pizza. They've drilled down through the ice, about 80 centimetres down, to reach the water, which they then pump to the surface to freeze.
By freezing that water, we thicken up the ice.
Nome is slightly below the Arctic Circle, and the trip there was more about testing the equipment than making any meaningful amounts of ice. But in early 2024, Andrea's team ventured about 220 kilometres above the Arctic Circle when they set up base at the Canadian High Arctic Research Centre in Cambridge Bay, Nunavut.
This time we were going to make a slightly larger scale experiment, and we were going importantly with a hydrogen fuel cell powered water pump this time. So we wanted to now test a source of energy which would still be zero emission while we use it, but it would be giving our pump more energy to operate for a longer period of time. Getting all the equipment to these remote locations is very difficult. So at Cambridge Bay, there is one ship per year going there. So if you need to transport something that cannot go by plane, you have one opportunity. In August, there is one ship carrying that material. So we had hydrogen with us that cannot go by plane. We had to ship it to get there in August.
Working in places like Cambridge Bay in the dead of winter is extremely difficult. It's so cold up there that the locals try not to turn off their vehicles for fear the engines will just freeze over.
We were always between the minus 40 and minus 50. Even a diesel engine has issues. We discovered that people in the area actually measure their trucks and cars not in miles that they can drive, but in hours that they can keep the car idle, because that's what they have to do. They move around and they idle their vehicles because they cannot restart them.
Andrea's team used skidoos with sleds on the back to ferry the equipment to the same pumping spot each day. They pumped the water across an area about the size of a soccer field.
And at the end, we had about 25 to 30 centimeters extra sea ice on top of what was already there at the beginning.
That much ice is not going to change the climate, but it gave Andrea's team some valuable lessons, including the realisation that working on top of the ice in the Arctic Circle is just about unbearable for both man and machine.
you really lose like layers of skin in your fingers and in your toes. And the first day, to find the right spot to operate on, we had to be on a skidoo for nearly 2 hours. And it was already like minus 35 Celsius temperature, with the wind chill was minus 47, plus the wind on the skidoo. It was unbearable. I was about to tap out our indigenous guide and say, let's go home, because I was in so much pain. Then they managed to put up a canvas tent, so we lost the effect of the wind. They put on a little heater into the tent, which went to something like minus 10, and we could breathe again. But it was so painful. We came home, my face was really marked, red, blue, black, my toes. I lost sensitivity for a few weeks after the trip. And so it was, quite significant.
And was the air literally painful to breathe in? It was that cold?
Yes, especially when you move the air on your face. Even if you have big ski goggles, balaclavas, layers, scarves and everything, you still get enough cold air on your face to feel the pain. Every object you touch, a metal object at minus 40, it's the equivalent of holding a hot rod. It's cold, but you get that even with 3 layers of gloves. Carrying the pump, a metal object, from one place to the other was so painful. It's not something that a person from the Mediterranean can deal with very easily. So I had frostbite nearly every day on my fingers, toes, face. So it was quite tough to be there.
Can you believe how much pain Andrea was willing to put himself through for this big green idea? He's a wealthy guy. He could just sit back and donate money and feel like he's doing something good for the Earth. And what's more, his team haven't even gone to the North Pole yet, where ideally they would deploy this kind of solution long term. It's only going to be colder up there. To help us understand the physical sacrifices that Andrea made, I dragged my producer Lap Fan down to an ice rink in Melbourne.
What are you getting me to do now, Pete?
Lap, your mission here today at the ice rink is to put your hand down on the ice and hold it there as long as you can until the pain becomes unbearable. Can you do that for me?
Oh, it is so freezing already. I can't imagine how cold it's going to be when I put my hand down there.
Come on, mate. It's for Tech Zero. You can do it.
The things I do for Tech Zero.
Now, Lap is getting down close to the ice, and he's extending his right hand. He's ready to start now. The hand is on the ice, ladies and gentlemen. The arm is shaking. 2.
Okay.
3.
Oh, straight away, I'm feeling it burn.
6. 7.
Oh, gosh.
10. 12.
Oh, I can feel the burning
15.
sensation already. Oh, gosh.
Well done.
Oh, gosh.
17 seconds, Lap. Not quite the sacrifice Andrea was willing to make, but still pretty good.
Man, my fingers, my hands are completely numb now. I just wonder how Andrea's going to do this in the high Arctic, where the temperatures are even going to be harsher than what they were in Canada.
Well, the thing is, he's got a plan for that. And we're going to explain more about it after this quick ad break. After putting their bodies through hell in Arctic Canada, Andrea's team came to the conclusion that working on top of the ice wasn't going to be the way to do this.
It gave us even more proof that we need to operate in a different way. This is why we came up with the idea of actually bringing all that kit underwater. Because underwater, you have a very controlled environment. Temperature is always around minus 1.5 degrees Celsius, no major. Obviously there's no precipitation, the currents are limited, you can move with very, very little energy. Think about a sort of robotic solution, an automated solution on top of sea ice would be extremely different. Strong winds, all types of precipitation, very low temperature, and the ice has ridges, it breaks, so moving on that surface would be extremely difficult. While if you're underwater, suddenly all of these difficulties go away.
Andrea's team have drawn up plans for a small submarine vehicle that will either be autonomous or remotely controlled from surface. Rather than drill a hole from the top of the ice downward, the idea is for the submarine to break through the ice from beneath.
So it's a submarine with a hot pipe sticking out that goes through the ice by using thermal energy. And once you watered the area, you re-iced it, it is retracted back into the submarine so it can go to the next spot, it can navigate and make another hole. We don't want to become an underwater vehicle manufacturer for the simple reason that it takes ages to become proper one. It's not something you learn in a year or two, and there's no time for this type of problem. So we want to partner with existing underwater vehicle manufacturers. And we've been discussing with a few manufacturers. You know what the issue is at this point in time is that most of these people are busy with sort of military projects. Very sad, unfortunately, but the geopolitics is coming a little bit against us at this stage because military projects pay well, pay now because there is an emergency globally to produce these type of devices. And instead of carrying pumps, they prefer to carry bombs, apparently. So everybody is totally focused at the moment on some sort of military project.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine was already a tragedy for its direct impact on people. But I reckon there's an additional layer of tragedy that we don't often think about. And that's the amount of time, money and effort that's going into this conflict, and how it could have been spent some other way in a peaceful world. Melting of the Arctic is the sort of existential challenge that affects every person on the planet. But rather than unite around that cause, we're fighting amongst ourselves as the proverbial ice gets thinner beneath our feet. Given that Russia is one of the biggest players in the Arctic Circle simply because of the size of its landmass and how far north its territory goes, I imagine that the isolation of Russia over the past couple of years from the rest of the world order over war in Ukraine probably is not helpful when it comes to trying to do things in the Arctic Circle, simply because it now sees many Western nations as an enemy, I guess.
Absolutely. And we've seen in particular from what we read that the Arctic Council has become less effective, if you want, with Russia being isolated. But fortunately, for a number of years, we won't need to go that far. I mean, if you think about Canada itself could be 80% of the solution because they have a massive exposure to a large part of the Arctic with their own archipelago. So we don't need to go full-on Arctic Council in the middle of the North Pole for quite a while. We could do quite a bit of our scaling phases over a number of years just working with, for instance, Canada and Alaska. So we are hopeful that later the geopolitical problems will be resolved and Russia will become, a player that could be helpful.
If you do in future start growing ice in the Arctic Ocean near the North Pole, will you have to apply for permission to anyone, or given that it's sort of international waters, could you just go up there and do it regardless?
No, it is a highly regulated environment. So there is the Arctic Council, I think, would sort of need to be in charge of deciding what can and cannot be done in the Arctic. And we believe this will be a matter for the United Nations.
In September last year, Real Ice filed its constitution with the United Kingdom's corporate regulator. Don't worry, I've read it, so you don't have to. That constitution made clear that Real Ice would never pay a dividend to its shareholders, and that it was a non-profit company established for public benefit rather than private gain. Now, Andrea knows the power of capitalism from his founding role at Ion Group. So I wanted to know why he thought Real Ice would do better as a not-for-profit.
For a couple of reasons. One, it's almost impossible to work with indigenous organizations, universities, etc. if people have a doubt about your real intentions. People think you're trying to do this to make money. They will think, You're not doing research. You're just trying to give answers that you already have in mind with your work. And we don't want to be in that space. We have zero interest in wasting our time just to come up with false research. Two, because we believe there is no time to waste. So by creating a company which is purely commercial, you immediately come up with problems like IP protection and trying to be secretive and competition and stuff like that. We're none about that. So at this stage, especially, all we are doing is open source. We want other people to look at what we do, to criticize constructively if they want to, if they think they can do it better, go on, do it better. We want to solve a climate problem. We don't want to create a commercial business. As I said, there will be space because we need a commercial mechanism. At some point, people will need to build devices, produce energy, and make operations in the Arctic. There will be people employed as a small industry. So this will become something which is commercial in nature. But before we get there, we need to be as fast as possible and as open as possible with what we are trying to do to receive as much help as we can to stimulate collaboration.
Right now, there's no shortage of Arctic communities rolling out the welcome mat for Andrea and the Real Ice team.
We have multiple plans for next winter. We know we can use in Europe the Gulf of Bothnia between Finland and Sweden to operate. So we made contact with the Finnish authorities there and a Finnish group called Operatio Arctics, which is a great group of young people advocating for climate intervention to be part of the general discourse. We will be welcomed in Finland to operate. And we also plan to go back to Cambridge Bay because the Canadian High Arctic Research Station is really a great place to work from. So we look forward to do these 2 trips, hopefully with the next generation of our technology.
I can understand the benefits of doing this. Is there any possible negative consequences, I guess, in terms of you're changing and altering a habitat? Is there any sort of, risk that you might harm something by doing this?
We want to dedicate the next 2 to 3 years to discover that. So we want to find out if there are any significant side effects. We know that every human activity has a side effect. Someone going out and driving a car, we know it has a big side effect in a way or another. So we want to make sure that any side effect is minimal. In particular, we'll be focusing on any impact on the sort of animal world. We don't want to create any disturbance for species that are important for the region and also important for the local population as well, like seals. So there are areas that could be related to noise or vibration with the devices for re-icing, which we want to investigate because we want to bring these devices underwater to operate autonomously in the future, which we'll investigate and we'll look for advice from experts in the sort of marine environments for that.
There's a section of the environment movement that opposes interventionist approaches like the one Andrea's working on with Real Ice. And that's because they fear it will lure society into a false sense of security and diminish the appetite for reducing emissions. Because after all, cutting emissions is the main game. But Andrea reckons it's too late for that kind of puritanical thinking. He reckons we need to cut emissions and roll up our sleeves on projects like ice thickening.
What we are doing is really ecosystem preservation. Like think of preserving a forest or a coral reef or a part of an ocean. You will need to use technology, even if you're just planting trees. You're not going to make holes with a finger and planting one seed at a time. If you want to do things at scale to preserve an ecosystem, you will need to manage it. You will need to replenish it where it's naturally lost. It's not different from what we are trying to do. We're trying to preserve what we currently still have, which is a precious resource. So we see ourselves in the space of ecosystem preservation and restoration in the Arctic. And we hope that this is what is recognized going forward with the ice thickening method.
Thanks for listening to Tech Zero. We'll be back with another episode in 2 weeks' time. This podcast was hosted and written by me, Peter Kerr. It was produced by Lap Fan, edited and sound designed by Martin Peralta. Big thanks to Cormac Lally, and the executive producer is Fiona Buffini. If you like the show and want to hear more, follow us wherever you get your podcasts and consider rating or reviewing us, as it helps us find other people. At the Financial Review, we investigate the big stories about markets, business and power. To subscribe to the Financial Review, go to afr.com/subscribe. You can also get in touch with us at techzero@afr.com. Tech Zero is part of the Financial Review's Carbon Challenge franchise.
The Australian Financial Review.